Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Henry Clay, The Man Who Would Be President, by James C. Klotter, narrated by James Anderson Foster. Prologue. The presidential campaign of 1844 had ended. Now Henry Clay awaited the results. Twice before he had received electoral votes for president. Twice he had been defeated. Another time he had sought his Whig party's nomination and had failed to receive it, only to see the nominee win the office of chief executive. Now, however, his friends agreed that this race represented his best opportunity to lead the nation. Because states held their elections on different days, news of the results trickled in over a period of almost 2 weeks. But as more returns became known, it seemed clear that if New York voted for Clay, he would become president. If it did not, he would taste bitter defeat once more. In that atmosphere, Clay and his wife attended a wedding as they waited for the fateful news. Any day a dispatch might bring jubilation or dejection. In Illinois, Lexington native Mary Todd Lincoln received a letter written by her stepmother telling what had transpired. As the hour approached for the arrival of the mail, I saw several gentlemen quietly leave the room, and, knowing their errand, I eagerly watched for their return. As soon as they came in the room, I knew by the expression of each countenance that New York had gone Democratic. The bearers of the news consulted together a moment. Then one of them advanced to Mr. Clay, who was standing in the center of a group, of which your father, Robert Todd, was one, and handed him a paper. Although I was sure of the news it contained, I watched Mr. Clay's face for confirmation of the evil tidings. He opened the paper, and as he read the death knell of his political hopes and lifelong ambition, I saw a distinct blue shade begin at the roots of his hair, pass slowly over his face like a cloud, and then disappear. He stood for a moment as if frozen. He laid down the paper and, turning to a table, filled a glass with wine, and raising it to his lips with a pleasant smile, said, "I drink to the health and happiness of all assembled here." Setting down his glass, he resumed his conversation as if nothing had occurred and was, as usual, the life and light of the company. 3 years later, a New York newspaper termed Clay the Great Rejected. Preface. On the 4th of July, 1861, in the early stages of the Civil War, a crowd gathered in Kentucky not to advocate for one side or the other, but rather to dedicate a monument to honor their state's most famous political leader, a man who had tried to avoid the war now raging around them. Henry Clay had died almost a decade earlier, but only now the tall memorial to honor him had been completed. At the top, 130 feet from the ground, stood an imposing statue of the man many called the Great Compromiser. It faced Clay's home of Ashland, and it majestically surveyed the scene around it. Even then, it would be another 3 years before the body of Henry Clay would be secured in its final resting place, in a sarcophagus at the base of the edifice. For years, the monument stood as a quiet testament to the man who had helped guide the nation in the crucial years of its history. But some 40 years later, a storm over Lexington unleashed thunder, high winds, and lightning bolts. The howling tempest hurled the head of the statue to the ground below, where the stately stone broke into several fragments. For 7 more years, the clay sculpture remained headless. Then, in 1910, the old statue was taken down to be replaced by a newer representation of the man buried below. But in its damaged state, the older figure shattered upon its removal. Workmen buried the pieces in a corner of the mausoleum. Soon, a new symbol of Clay looked down on the world of the 20th century, and the old one seemed forgotten. Like the statue in Lexington Cemetery, Clay's reputation rose and fell during the years after his death, sometimes looming large and imposing, sometimes appearing broken, the man largely forgotten. Initially, the pendulum of history seemed to swing Clay's way, but during Clay's lifetime, his two bitter rivals were Democrats Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun, and in the struggle for historical attention, they began to win out once more. Decades later, with the hard days of the Great Depression, with the business and bank failures, and with the party of Andrew Jackson ever more popular, the hero of the common man began to appeal more to Americans. Even though Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal owed much of its philosophical basis to Clay's belief in the role of the central government in economic planning, Jackson's words and image resonated louder. Jackson Day dinners and new books about the general left Clay either the villain or a bit actor in the pageant. Jackson ruled. Later yet, in the Cold War era, readers likewise seemed more attracted for a time to Calhoun's absolutism and abstract reasoning than to Clay's pragmatism and compromises. But scholars abhor historical vacuums. During the last 3 decades, that pendulum began to swing back, and writers started once more to give Henry Clay greater prominence in the history of his era. As it became clear that both current American parties owed part of their ancestry to Clay's Whig Party, books have focused increasingly on those past partisans. At the same time, changes in American society dimmed the appeal of Jackson and Calhoun. The South Carolinian's obstructionist stands and his unyielding defense of slavery seemed less noble in the era of civil rights resistance in the South, and scholars began to present the war hero in a much less heroic way, given Jackson's racist views, his treatment of Native Americans, his laissez-faire philosophy, and his arbitrary actions. By contrast, Clay now appeared more modern, more progressive, and more valued. By the 21st century, discordant party rhetoric also may have caused Clay to grow more appealing and more vital as a subject of study. His ability to rise on occasion above state or section or party, his capacity to produce workable compromises, and just his sheer talent caused people to focus attention on him. The views of Henry Clay range from that of one writer who called him an LBJ-like figure to that of a critic who looked at his policies and labeled him of all things a National Socialist. More commonly, a greater number of Americans have agreed with the journalist who perused contemporary politics and stressed our need for another Henry Clay. So, is there anything more to be said about Henry Clay? When this project was begun, the question motivating it was a simple one. Why did Clay not win the presidency? A corollary query involved another issue. Why did Clay's contemporaries continue to support him for the nation's highest political office despite his many defeats? In short, this project started as a study of Clay and the presidency. And so this is not a biography per se of Henry Clay. Instead, it focuses on the aspects of his life and career that had an impact on his presidential searches and races. But very quickly into the study, it became clear that it must contain extensive biographical elements, for a person's life may well shape the formation of him as a candidate. Beyond that, no political entity exists only in the maelstrom of a campaign. Clay's career, his compromises, his policies, his lifestyle, all became subjects of intense scrutiny and debate. That made this work not only a political story, but also a social, intellectual, economic, and family one. As with current political candidates, everything Clay did had the potential to become part of a race. A possible presidential candidate for at least a quarter century, he stood always in the gaze of millions. Usually half of those voters praised him, while the other half damned him. Yet every casual word, each private conversation, any thoughtless action could be used against him. Whenever he left the relative safe confines of his estate, supporters flocked to him and enemies scorned him. As one journal noted, Clay could not move in public without having to harangue a deputation of political friends, and stand to be kissed by ladies and pump-handled by men, and hide the enormous bane of it beneath a fixed smile. Even in his home, he could not separate himself from public life. Enormous amounts of mail demanded answers as he posed for artists, talked to journalists, revealed himself to biographers, and regaled with stories the numerous domestic tourists and foreign travelers who appeared at his door. He might enjoy some quiet moments with his family, but even then sorrows tormented him. Should he devote more time to his wife, children, and grandchildren? Or should he pay more attention to the model farm that helped him meet his constant financial obligations? Or should he continue to serve in Congress and do more to advance his presidential ambitions? Clay's private life was seldom private and usually could not be separated from his public person. This story, then, is about the making of a person and a politician, as well as the unmaking of a presidential candidate. An 1847 journalist asked, "How come it that if Mr. Clay, unquestionably the greatest statesman of America, is also the most popular, how come it that his efforts for the presidency have invariably ended in inglorious defeat?" Or, to put it another way, why did Clay not win the presidency? That question seemed relatively simple and straightforward. After all, for most candidates for the presidency, one defeat is usually the death of any future hopes for the office. As one 20th century politician explained, a defeated candidate is a kind of pariah. They never ask him to the party anymore. Among major candidates, only Henry Clay and William Jennings Bryan 3 times received electoral votes for the highest political post in the nation, and lost all 3 times. 2 other candidates, Martin Van Buren and Grover Cleveland, also ran 3 times, but they both won at least 1 time. What was it that caused Clay's losses? After all, Henry Clay seemed to have it all. He pointed to his humble origins and his support from the masses, yet he also owned a plantation and ran in aristocratic circles. He lived in an agricultural area, yet he called for industrial growth. He won acclaim for his passionate oratory and his ability to convince in the heat of debate, yet he formulated a policy, a system, that appealed primarily to voters' reason. He supported the start of the then popular War of 1812, yet he helped make the peace that concluded a then unpopular contest. He rose to prominence as a spokesman of the West, yet he became most identified as a stalwart of the Union beyond sectional divides. He spoke with slaveholders as one of them, yet he also publicly voiced anti-slavery sentiments. He stood up forcefully for his stated principles, yet he gained fame for his compromises. Democrat and aristocrat, agrarian and businessman, war hawk and peacemaker, sectionalist and nationalist, slaveholder and anti-slavery advocate, man of principle and man of compromise, Clay could appeal to various constituencies. But he also seemed a paradox, given the different sides he showed the public. His career appeared made for the presidency. U.S. Senator before the age of 30, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives on the first day of his service to that body, diplomat and Secretary of State, forger of famous compromises to diffuse sectional tensions, leader of his party, formulator of the American system. This man of great charisma appeared to have the needed experience and to possess all the qualifications. In antebellum America, everywhere one looked, there was the hand of Henry Clay. Yet, despite his strengths, Clay could not win the political office he most coveted. Posterity would name him one of the nation's most important U.S. senators and one of the 100 most influential Americans. A 1990s survey of hundreds of historians and political scientists asked which candidate they would vote for now who ran in the presidential races of the past. In that survey, Clay outpolled his opponents in 2 of his 3 presidential races, yet voters did not so reward his services with election to that office. Both his contemporaries and modern-day commentators have pointed to myriad reasons for those defeats. The almost bewildering variety of answers became almost contradictory. Clay was too political. He was not political enough. Clay was too pro-slavery. He was too anti-slavery. Clay was too dictatorial in Congress. He was too much of a compromiser. Clay was too sectional. He was not sectional enough. Clay was too devoted to principle. He was too unprincipled. Clay was too tied to the old Republican ideals of his youth. He was too much in advance of his times. Others have argued that Clay expressed his opinions too openly and too often, that he made serious strategic mistakes, that he reacted badly in the heat of battle. Some critics pointed to Clay's duels, his character, and his moral makeup as explanations for the losses. A few note that he simply suffered from bad luck and bad timing. In short, Clay had so many gaps in his political armor that opponents could easily find a weak spot to exploit. Most of the answers fault the error-prone Kentuckian for being the unwitting architect of his own downfall. And when I started this project, I admittedly had a more critical view of Clay. The story I expected to tell was one that would have criticized Clay more for not being true to his instincts, for being a compromiser when he should have taken a stronger stand, for being all fluff and no substance, for being a waffler, in short, an example of what a political leader should not be. But I was forced to modify those views. Another look at Henry Clay and the American presidency suggested that while the conventional wisdom may not necessarily be wrong, the best answer is found beyond that. That is, no single factor explains Clay's defeats. Each chapter in his search for the presidency had its own storyline, and what appeared important in one race might be less important in the next. If there is one answer, it would be that the many cuts he suffered bled the political lifeblood from the candidate. But going beyond that explanation and focusing on Clay and the presidency revealed how some of the strengths he brought to his candidacy also proved to be weaknesses. As a compromiser, he angered both extremes and so lost votes. As a nationalist, he upset those who chiefly spoke for one section. As an anti-slavery slaveholder, he alienated both camps. As a person with a specific program, a man who voted on controversial bills, an individual who took open stands on issues, he was a target for political attacks. Yet all those factors reveal much about politics then and now. If electing key leaders is crucial to making democracy work, then citizens must continue to learn from history. The question of one Clay ally after his hero's defeat in 1844 still echoes across the years. And shall we never more hear that deep, melodious voice in the Senate or before our people, never see that beaming countenance, that flashing eye illuminated with the radiant gleamings of his great soul? Who will take his place? Perhaps no one could or has taken his place, but the Clay story in both positive and negative ways has meaning and importance for us even now. 1. Preparation. In March 1840, Henry Clay returned to the place of his birth. Born on April 12, 1777, in an area of eastern Virginia known as the Slashes, he had not seen that home for almost a half-century. In that time, politically oriented biographers had crafted their accounts of his early years, and others would continue to add to the story. They told of the early demise of Clay's poor and pious clergyman father, whose passing left the family in abject poverty, and the widow with little more than 7 children. That tragic death had made son Henry a poor and friendless orphan boy at the age of 4, and he had received limited education as a result. Instead, he would work the fields, and the shoeless, sunburnt boy would mount an old horse and take corn to a distant mill to help provide for the family. In the biographer's portrayal, this mill boy of the Slashes, born in poverty and obscurity, had raised himself by the force of his brilliance and had risen to become the self-made man of America. Clay reinforced those elements of his life story with his own words. When a caustic critic condemned him in 1824 for his lack of learning, Clay responded that he knew his weaknesses. "I was born to no proud patrimonial estate. From my father I inherited only infancy, ignorance, and indigence. I feel my defects." Later, when supporting aid for public education, he dramatized again his humble origins, stressing that he had been left an orphan, too young to have been conscious of a father's smiles and caresses, with a widowed mother surrounded by numerous offspring, in the midst of pecuniary embarrassments, without a regular education, without fortune, without friends, without patrons. Given all that, he would reasonably conclude, "I have reason to be satisfied with my public career." And well he might, for by 1840 he had been a state representative, U.S. representative, U.S. senator, diplomat, secretary of state, the great compromiser, and twice presidential candidate. But many of his most important years lay ahead. In 1840, Henry Clay returned to the memories of a past that he had left behind so many years earlier. Here, in the spirit of a pilgrim, he came to see people and places from his past. Here his heart returned to cherished spots. Here he came home. Marveling at what he saw, he wrote his wife, "Everything was changed. No stone marker, but rather a field of wheat covered his father's and grandparents' graves, long leveled by the plow. A fondly remembered hickory tree now stood in decay. His old homestead between Black Tom Slash and Hanover Courthouse had been greatly modified, and he barely recognized the room of his birth. The old St. Paul's Church, where he had attended school for 2 years, seemed on the verge of collapse. The whole experience strengthened Clay's sense of his own mortality and of his place in history. Yet his remembered origins and his political present did not always completely coincide. The invented life and the historical one could diverge considerably, but sometimes they did not. As Clay noted, he had been orphaned at the age of 4, and he never really knew his father or grandfather. John Clay had been a little over 40 years old when he died, leaving Elizabeth Hudson Clay a widow in her 30s. At almost the same time, the family experienced further trauma. As Henry Clay noted later, he was rocked in the cradle of the Revolution. That became reality when Sir Berest Tarleton's British troops came to the Clay household, seized food, destroyed furniture, confiscated slaves, and then plunged their swords into the fresh graves of Clay's father and grandfather, thinking the family had buried valuables there. That image of desecration would later affect Clay's political actions, and he clearly remembered the event 6 decades later. Death and violence were a recurring part of Clay's childhood. But other parts of the Clay story, as told by early biographers, as well as Clay himself, did not reflect reality. That struggle between fact and fiction would infiltrate Clay's entire public life. In contrast to the image of Reverend John Clay as a poverty-stricken minister of the Old Dominion, in truth, Henry's father came from a distinguished family that had been in Virginia almost from the first English settlement. Sir John, as he was called by contemporaries, held sizable landholdings of over 450 acres and owned at least 20 slaves. Most of that estate went to his widow, leaving the family in a comfortable situation. Her remarriage at age 33 to the considerably younger Henry Watkins, a planter, militia captain, and brother of her sister's husband, brought further stability to the household and helped shape the boy and would-be president. Well-to-do in his own right, Watkins turned out to be a kind stepfather to young Henry and an important influence. Still, Clay did not live a life of ease. His first memory involved walking behind a plow. Moreover, the family experienced hardships of another kind. Of the 9 children of John and Elizabeth Clay, only 3 lived to become adults. Henry's mother also bore more children in her second marriage for a total of 16. His father's death, his mother's remarriage, his new stepfather, the death of siblings, an influx of half-brothers and sisters, all shaped the man and the politician he became. During his subsequent career, Henry Clay left a sizable record through his printed speeches, manuscripts, and recorded conversations. Yet in all those words he said remarkably little about his parents and siblings except concerning his formative years. In the early 1790s, his mother, her husband, and their expanding family moved to the new frontier of Kentucky, but Henry remained behind. The 14-year-old's feelings at the time about that kind of virtual abandonment remain unknown. Perhaps the choice was his, but a paucity of familial love may have been a factor in forming the public man who searched for the nation's affection. If the orphaned mill boy of the Slashes representation grew out of a factual basis, and the poor, penniless image did not, Clay's educational accomplishments tell a more mixed story. In 1820, John Quincy Adams thought his rising opponent had a mind very defective in elementary education, and a congressman who knew Clay called him not a man of much study. In some ways, they both were correct. Clay did have little formal schooling, 3 years in his home county, but he was not as uneducated as his detractors sneered, or even as he sometimes suggested. He admitted that he had never learned Latin or Greek, and that he studied too little and relied too heavily on the resources of my genius. But all that masked the fact that the raw boy and then the adult man continued to learn, to grow intellectually, to read long after the classroom bell last rang. As a youngster, Clay memorized poetry while studying history and science. Later in life, he purchased numerous books, including a set of Shakespeare's works. Clay advised a son to read history and noted his own appreciation for such authors as Plutarch, Socrates, Gibbon, Hume, Hallam, and Marshall, suggesting a reasonably well-read man. Clay also proved to be a voracious consumer of newspapers. In 1823, he received a half-dozen on a regular basis, and 6 years later, the list had grown to almost 20 from 10 different states. People in politics might fault Clay's education, but few faulted his intelligence. In fact, Adams, in the same sentence in which he derided Clay's deficiencies, approved the man's vigorous intellect. High praise indeed from the often disparaging New Englander. Another Clay critic, John Tyler, grudgingly admitted that Clay had an intellect of the highest order. Of course, intellect does not always transfer into intelligent actions, and though smart, Clay made mistakes, often. But if neither as well educated nor as well read as some leaders of his generation, he seldom took second place to anyone in the intellectual give and take of debate. He could constantly draw out relevant examples from memory, could formulate appropriate answers quickly, and could win over his auditors with his ideas and the force of his argument. In private settings or public courtrooms, few could out-argue him. To some, Clay might be better read in men than in books. As Adams noted, his school has been the world. But when that street sense combined with a mostly underappreciated intellect, it belied the ill-educated image often attributed to Clay. In fact, the entire self-made man image propagated by Clay and his supporters stressed how Clay rose from obscurity on the force of his talent. Much of that was correct, yet at the same time, he might not have accomplished what he had if he had not had much help along the way. His stepfather recognized Clay's possibilities early and secured the 14-year-old a position as a clerk in a store in Richmond. Then he obtained a post for him in the office of the clerk of the Chancery. Soon after that, the Clay family ventured to Kentucky and left Henry to deal with life as a young teenager, almost alone in what seemed to be a big city. He and his fellow clerks played cards, placed bets on the thoroughbreds, and courted the ladies. But more important for Clay's future, his duties meant that he observed the many talented Virginia leaders at work. He listened to their oratory, watched their debates, and digested their arguments. Perhaps the highlight of his time in the Old Dominion was when Clay twice heard Patrick Henry speak. The great orator from his home county so impressed Clay that he said he never forgot the ringing tones of that fiery voice. His stepfather's aid got Clay started down a career path, but Henry's real opportunity came when the legendary George Wythe, sole chancellor of the High Court of Chancery and the state's...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?